Welcome back to Twisted Tales of Murder. London, a city famed for its lush greenery, with over 30,000 parks sprawling across more than 35,000 acres. But beneath the canopy of leaves and winding footpaths, shadows linger and secrets fester. The Green Chain Walk, a network of secluded trails stretching over 50 miles, weaves through parks of South London, is the backdrop of this twisted tale. By day, it's a haven of joggers, dog walkers, and sunseekers, young mothers pushing strollers along the path, their laughter shadowed by the rustling trees. But when the sun fades and the air grows thick with silence, the Green Chain Walk becomes something else entirely. A place where footsteps echo when no one is there. A place where the missing are whispered about but never found. And tonight, we uncover one of the darkest tales. But before we dive into the horror left behind by a monster who would be known as the Green Chain Killer, make sure to like and subscribe and leave comments. Because once you hear this story, you might not walk alone at night, or even during the day, ever again. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, a string of brutal rapes and murders along the Green Chain Walk sent waves of terror through London. But the horror didn't end with the crimes themselves. The killings were allowed to continue, not just because of the perpetrator's cunning nature, but due to a chilling mix of incompetence and blind faith in a single deeply flawed criminal profile. Critical evidence was overlooked, leads were ignored, and as the victims piled up, so did the failures of the very institutions meant to protect the public. It was a warm August morning in 1989, and a young mother in southeast London was beginning her daily routine. The sun cast shadows through the trees near Plumstead Common Park, and the air was thick with the last breaths of summer. Wanting to let the cool summer breeze in, she left the back door open as she hurried to get her children ready for school. She didn't hear him enter. When she turned around, he was already there, standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the light. In his hand, a glinting knife. Her blood ran cold. Before she could scream, he moved. What followed was a nightmare unfolding in front of her terrified children. The intruder showed no mercy, his presence like a shadow of pure malice. The man brutally raped the woman in front of her children. Yet as suddenly as he arrived, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but horror, the echoes of her children's cries, and the chilling certainty that he had chosen her that morning. And somewhere out in the quiet streets of London, he walked away, unhurried, vanishing into the city like a ghost. Then, 3 months later, Pauline Lasham picked up the phone with trembling hands and called the police. Her son, Robert Napper, had confessed something to her, something monstrous. He had raped a woman in Plumstead Common, near their home. His words were cold, matter-of-fact, as if he were describing the weather. The police checked their records, flipped through reports. Nothing matched. No rapes had been reported in the park at that time. What they didn't realize, what they failed to connect, was that the rape hadn't happened in the open air of Plumstead Common. It had happened inside a woman's home, behind walls that failed to keep the horror out. This detail was just off enough to slip through the cracks, and so the case was left to rot in the dark. No further action, no alarms raised. Law enforcement's first mistake. Robert Napper was 23 years old, a troubled man with a mind fractured by darkness. He suffered from Asperger's syndrome and later was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But his demons had begun long before those labels were given. As a child, he had been forced to witness horrors no child should ever see. Night after night, he watched his father unleash brutal violence upon his mother. The echoes of her cries became part of the very fabric of his young mind. When he was 9, the nightmare ended, not with peace, but with his parents' divorce. Yet for Robert, the damage had already been done. Separated from what was left of his broken home, he and his siblings were placed in foster care. He spent the next 6 years drifting in and out of psychiatric treatment, doctors trying to untangle the twisted pathways of his thoughts. But something had already taken root, something that no amount of therapy could erase. Then, on a camping trip at the age of 12, Robert was sexually abused by a family friend. The trauma awakened something in Robert, something dark, something irreplaceable. In his early teens, the signs were already there. One day, without warning, he raised an air gun and pulled the trigger, shooting his own brother in the face. Was it an accident? Or was it a glimpse into the depths of his growing cruelty? And at home, in secret, his depravity took another form. He watched his sister undressing, lurking in the darkness, unseen but always present. At school, he was an utter outcast, not just disliked, but an utter alien to those around him. There was something about Robert that unsettled people, something unspoken but deeply felt. The other students kept their distance, sensing the quiet storm building inside him. Then, at 19, he was caught wandering in public with a loaded gun. It was a clear warning, a red flag, so bright it was impossible to ignore. Yet the system failed again. His punishment? A mere 10-pound fine. Police mistake number 2. Then, in March of 1992, the horror returned. 2 more rapes were reported along the Green Chain Walk in southeast London, a secluded stretch of pathway winding through parks and woodlands, perfect for someone who wanted to strike unseen. The brutal attacks were methodical. The perpetrator had learned. He had grown bolder, but he wasn't finished. Months later, he struck again. This time, his victim was a young mother, walking peacefully with her child in the stroller. Broad daylight offered no safety. From witness reports, police pieced together a sketch of the suspect. When it was finished, it bore an unsettling resemblance to Robert Napper. It wasn't just the sketch. Several of his neighbors had already whispered his name to authorities, uneasy with his presence, suspicious of his behavior. He was no stranger to violence. He was no stranger to darkness. And so police finally brought him in for questioning. During the interrogation, detectives asked Robert to submit his DNA. Twice he agreed. Twice he failed to show up for his appointment. A red flag was waving right in front of the police, and yet no one followed up. No officers knocked on his door, no warrants were served, no alarms were raised. Indeed, Robert was dismissed, not because of lack of evidence, not because of an alibi, but because of his height. Robert Napper stood at 6 feet 4 inches. Witnesses had described the Green Chain rapist as someone shorter. 15 miles away in southwest London lay another park, Wimbledon Common, a place of serenity where families walked, jogged, and children played beneath trees. But on the morning of July 15th, 1992, its peace was shattered forever. Rachel Nichol, a young mother, was strolling through a wooded area of the park with her 2-year-old son, Alex. The sun filtered through the leaves, and the morning felt ordinary, safe. Around them, nearly 500 people filled the park, enjoying the summer air. And yet none of them saw the horror that unfolded. Out of nowhere, a perpetrator struck. Rachel was dragged to the ground, raped at knife point, and then brutally stabbed 49 times. The blade carved through her flesh with precision. Finally, Her throat was slashed so deeply, so savagely, that she was nearly decapitated. And through it all, her son watched. The little boy, just shy of his third birthday, was frozen in horror. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He could only watch as his mother's blood soaked through the earth. Minutes later, an elderly man stumbled upon this heartbreaking sight, a small child kneeling beside his mother's lifeless body. Rachel Nichol was beyond saving. The older man alerted the police, and within moments, the park became a crime scene. Officers swarmed in, questioning everyone they could find. But the killer? He was already gone. Then there was Colin Stagg, a 30-year-old man who lived near Wimbledon Common and often walked his dog through the park. But on one Wednesday morning, as he approached the entrance to the park, police stopped him. Their expressions were tense, their voices were firm. They told him there had been an incident. No one was allowed in. Colin paused, then mentioned he had already been in the park earlier that morning. The officers exchanged glances. They took down his name, his address. Then, without much more, they nodded and let him go. The crime scene where Rachel Nichol was murdered was drenched in blood, a scene of pure savagery. And yet, despite the brutality, police were left with almost no evidence. There was only a single minuscule speck on her body that might have contained DNA. But in 1992, forensic science was still in its infancy. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough to extract anything useful. Weeks passed. Then, after a month, the investigation dragged on. Detectives interviewed over 100 people, chasing leads that led nowhere. And still, they were no closer to finding the monster who had butchered Rachel. The trail was already getting cold, and the killer was still out there. Desperate for answers, the police turned to renowned criminal psychologist Paul Britton. His expertise in profiling violent offenders had been instrumental in solving other high-profile cases, and they hoped he could do the same here. Paul had already been working on another case, the Green Chain Rapes. He had spent time studying the attacker's motives, his mindset, and his escalation. And yet, he nor the police saw a connection between the brutal murder of Rachel Nichol and the string of rapes that terrorized Southeast London. Was it just an oversight or a tragic miscalculation? A psychological profile of the killer was developed. It was believed he was 20 to 30-year-old loner with isolated hobbies. He likely lived near Wimbledon Commons, had an obsession with knives, and possibly had knowledge or an interest in a cult. Britton also suggested that the killer viewed women as sexual objects and exhibited traits of sexual sadism. Rachel Nichol was a beautiful blonde model whose brutal murder shocked the nation. With her young son as the sole witness, the media intensified the pressure on law enforcement, demanding swift justice. Paul Britton's psychological profile of the killer was widely circulated on television, fueling public fear and speculation. Soon, the police began to receive anonymous calls about one man, Colin Stagg. I know you were expecting me to say Robert Naper, but no, the new spotlight was on Colin Stagg. When police arrived at his home, he welcomed them in without hesitation. He had no prior arrests, yet the police were conflicted. He fit their psychological profile. He lived alone near the park and was somewhat of a loner and was 30 years old. But what truly raised their suspicion was a single book about a cult that was resting on his bookshelf. A cult refers to a realm of mystical and supernatural beliefs and practices that lie beyond the reach of organized religion and science. It is tied to hidden or secret forces, encompassing magic, mystical, and unexplained mysteries that fascinate some and unsettle others. Colin Stagg was arrested and brought in for further questioning. However, with no evidence, only suspicion linking him to Rachel Nichols' murder, the police were forced to release him after 3 days. Then, on news of Colin's arrest as it spread through the media, the police received a call from a woman named Julie Pines. She had met Colin through a dating advertisement. Think of it as an old-school version of a dating app before cell phones. The two exchanged letters, and as their correspondence became more intimate, Colin confided in her about a fantasy of having sex in public. Julie still had the letter and turned it over to police. For investigators, this was yet another reason to believe Colin was guilty. A book about a cult and a letter about sexual fantasies? To them, it all pointed to murder. That is quite the stretch. Since when do personal interests and private fantasies make someone a killer? I'm not buying it. Then the police took it one step further. Under the guidance of our criminal profiler, they devised an elaborate and psychologically manipulative plan. For the next 28 days, detectives orchestrated an intricate web of deception. At the center of it was Lizzie James, an undercover female officer chosen to lure Colin Stagg into their trap. She posed as a friend of Julie Pines, reaching out to Colin with carefully crafted letters. Unlike Julie, Lizzie claimed to be far more open-minded, adventurous, and unafraid to explore the darker corners of desire. With each letter, she pushed the boundaries, mirroring his thoughts, coaxing him to reveal his deepest fantasies, perhaps even to confess to something more sinister. The police weren't just investigating Colin Stagg. They were playing with his mind, feeding in to their own suspicions and hoping he would unknowingly seal his fate. He had no idea that every word he wrote, every secret he shared, was being analyzed, twisted, and being used to build a case against him. The real question was, how far would the police go to make him confess to a crime he may not have committed? It turned out at the time, Colin had never even been with a woman sexually, and was quite innocent in his replies to Lizzie. When Lizzie wrote suggestive letters laced with sexual innuendos, his responses were naive and even romantic. He dreamily spoke of sipping parsnip wine with her on a veranda, his words far from indecent, even when Lizzie provoked him. So, what exactly is parsnip wine, you may ask? Have you ever tried it? Would you be adventurous enough to know what it tastes like? I don't know if I would. Anyways, detectives realized they needed more, so they instructed Lizzie to become a bit more forward. She wrote to him saying, "I'm sure your fantasies know no bounds, and you're as broad-minded and uninhibited as I am." Colin's responses almost mirrored her words. When Lizzie escalated the conversation further, saying, "The things that happened when I was with a man are not that normal people like. And even though these things are wrong and make me feel guilty, I can't forget how exhilarating they made me feel. I need to feel defenseless and humiliated." I wonder if Colin just wanted to have sex with a woman, so he told her what he thought she wanted to hear. Lizzie continued to escalate the letters, making them more sexually explicit and even violent. As the investigation deepened, the detectives decided to take an even more direct approach. They arranged for Lizzie to meet Colin in person, while undercover officers kept a close watch. The meeting took place in a coffee shop, a seemingly innocent setting for a conversation that would take a dark turn. When Lizzie revealed her dark secret to Colin, she told him that her former boyfriend had been involved in black magic, and that the two of them had once murdered a pregnant woman as part of a human sacrifice. Colin was clearly unsettled. He listened intently, but said nothing in return, playing along with her disturbing tales, even as he quietly began to doubt her sanity. How is this not clearly entrapment? The entire operation seems designed to push Colin into confessing to something he may not have been involved in, rather than actively searching for the real killer. At what point does the line between investigation and manipulation blur to the point of unethical behavior? The police weren't merely following leads, they were deliberately crafting a narrative, feeding Colin with escalating fantasies and violent stories in an attempt to provoke him into an admission. Instead of focusing on hard evidence, they were bending the situation to fit their suspicions, hoping to create the very criminal they believed existed. Rather than actively pursuing other suspects and investigating concrete leads, the authorities were engaged in a psychological manipulation game. They built a case based on his interactions with Lizzie, pushing him to respond in ways that could be misinterpreted as guilt. This raises serious ethical concerns about the lengths to which they were willing to go. Why weren't they using their resources to find the true predator? Why weren't they seeking justice for Rachel through traditional investigative methods? Instead, they seem fixated on turning Colin into the killer, which creates an unconceivable question. Was the truth less important than confirming their own theory? By the third meeting, one has to wonder, why didn't Colin run for the hills after their first encounter? Lizzie had already pushed him far beyond his comfort zone. She pressed him even further, coaxing him to open up about his past. It was during this conversation that Colin, seemingly caught in the web of her manipulation, confessed that he had been arrested for the murder of Rachel Nichol. However, he pled his innocence. To Lizzie, this revelation was more than just an admission. It was a thrill. She responded with excitement, saying she would have sex with the man who committed this horrific crime. But that crossed a line for Colin. Unnerved and perhaps overwhelmed by the manipulation, he pulled back and told her firmly, "No, I'm sorry, that's not me." Despite the mounting pressure, he drew a line in the sand, rejecting the dangerous fantasy Lizzie had created. Throughout all of his contact with Lizzie, Colin never once suggested that he had any involvement in the murder of Rachel Nichol. Despite this, the police refused to believe it. They remained convinced that the language in the letters aligned with the psychological profile that was created. And on August 17th, 1993, Colin Stagg was once again arrested, this time on suspicion of Rachel Nichol's murder. After pouring 2 years and £3 million into this operation, the police were unwavering in their beliefs that they had finally caught the right man. They had worked tirelessly to build their case, convinced that the psychological profile and the manipulation experienced with Lizzie had led them to their suspect. But was it enough to justify the years of investigation and the pressure placed on Colin? Meanwhile, the rapes continued along the green chain, but both the detectives and the prosecutors remained steadfast in their refusal to connect these assaults to the murder of Rachel Nichol. Despite mounting evidence of similar crimes in the area, they remained fixated on Colin Stagg, convinced he was their man. Then, 3 months after Colin's arrest, while he sat in jail, a new murder occurred. This time it was in Plumstead, southeast London. The chilling similarities between the new murder and the one of Rachel only deepened the mystery, raising further questions about whether the police were pursuing the right suspect. The victim was Samantha Bissett, and her tragic death, along with that of her 4-year-old daughter, sent shockwaves through the community. The pair were brutally murdered in their own home. The crime was a horrifying act of violence. Samantha was savagely butchered with a knife, and parts of her body were mutilated and taken as a twisted trophy. Meanwhile, her innocent daughter was raped and then smothered to death. This killer was nothing short of a monster, an embodiment of pure, unspeakable evil. The brutality of the crime marked a new level of disparity, and it was clear that the investigation was far from over. Then, more ridiculous lapses in police judgment occurred. The murder squad investigating Rachel's case was invited to collaborate on the Plumstead murder investigation, but they denied the offer. They were so convinced they had their man, Colin Stagg, that they refused to even consider the possibility that another killer might be responsible. How and why were the police so stubborn and close-minded? Their refusal to examine new evidence and consider other theories was a stunning display of tunnel vision. They were so focused on Colin that they failed to see the bigger picture. At the Samantha Bissett crime scene, investigators uncovered a crucial lead. They found Robert Naper's fingerprints on the outside balcony and a bloody shoe print in the kitchen that matched shoes found at his home. As the pieces started to fall into place, the evidence pointed directly at him. But it didn't stop there. When they went to arrest him, they discovered a book containing a map with detailed notes marking locations and making chilling comments about the violent acts he did to women. These markings corresponded to several locations along the Green Chain where previous rapes had occurred. Yet, even with the direct connection staring them in the face, investigators still refused to link him to the Green Chain rapes. I just don't get it. How could they ignore the obvious signs? The evidence was mounting, yet they refused to see what was right in front of them. Why was there such reluctancy to make the connection? It's as though the pieces of the puzzle were deliberately ignored. As if the map wasn't damning enough, investigators also found his fingerprints on a bloody knife buried in Wimbledon Commons, just 100 yards from where Rachel was brutally murdered. The connection to her death was undeniable. Yet, despite these crucial pieces of evidence, the police ignored it. Failure to act on such overwhelming evidence leaves you to wonder what was driving their refusal to acknowledge the obvious. Were they too invested in their pursuit of Colin Stagg, or was there another reason that they kept overlooking Robert, even as the evidence piled up against him? As Robert walked free, Colin Stagg remained in jail awaiting trial. Yet after 14 months in custody, a judge took a closer look at how the police had coaxed Colin into making a statement. He saw the manipulation for what it was and threw the case out. The judge went on to describe the tactics used by the police as nothing more than a honey trap, a calculated ploy designed to entrap Stagg into confessing. Though Stagg was released from jail and all charges against him were dropped, the damage had already been done. And though the legal system had cleared him, the shadow of suspicion would haunt him forever. The investigators in Rachel's murder spent over 3 years and £3 million pursuing Colin and tried to mold him into their suspect. Despite the immense time and resources wasted on the case, they refused to admit they were wrong. Robert evaded police for 16 years, largely due to their failure to properly investigate critical evidence. He was eventually arrested and pled guilty in November of 1995. As Robert's crimes escalated from a peeping Tom to a stalker, then to multiple rapes, and ultimately he became the killer we know him today, he came into police radar at least 7 times. On at least 2 of those occasions, his behavior clearly indicated he was a danger to women, but he was never pursued further. Despite repeated chances to apprehend him, authorities failed to connect the dots. Robert admitted to 6 crimes, 3 murders, 2 rapes, and an attempted rape. Still, he refuses to discuss any other potential crimes unless the police can produce scientific proof of his involvement. His signature was targeting young mothers accompanied by their children, a pattern that raised troubling psychological insight. While psychologists have attributed this behavior to childhood marked with abuse and domestic violence, detectives believe Robert's choices was more calculated. He believed women with children would be more compliant with his demands, making them easier victims. You may be wondering what happened to the man whose life was ruined by the police. Colin Stagg was awarded £706,000 in compensation for being the victim of a miscarriage of justice. While he received a formal public apology from the police, the psychologists behind the profile refused to offer an apology. To this day, Colin says some people still believe he murdered Rachel. The detective who attempted to lure Colin into confessing to a crime he didn't commit was awarded £125,000 in compensation. She claimed her undercover work on the case ruined her career. Ultimately, the case led to significant changes in how investigations are handled in the UK. In total, it is believed that Robert is responsible for 106 attacks across London during the late 1980s and 90s. That's all for today. Make sure to like, subscribe, and until next time, stay safe.